Go to AP Classroom. And then take a look at our TQs. Now, you guys have to remember that, you know, with multiple choice questions, whether I write them or in this case of AP Classroom, the College Board, there are always going to be multiple choice questions where you might feel like you could argue for one answer and argue for another. And again, I know it can be really difficult, and I know I was always annoyed by this in school. I was always trying to find the best answer. Um, and just know that it's just a piece of the puzzle. With the AP exam, there is a free response question aspect to the exam, or like a short writing, and that's usually where, for those of you guys who have strong argumentative tendencies and you write well and you formulate good arguments, you can actually really knock that exam out of the park. Um, the multiple choice is just a small part of it. Well, actually, not a small part of it, but it's generally not as difficult or taxing as the free response portion. Okay, so we were looking at age structure diagrams, the age structure population pyramids on Friday. You know, we've got the really rapidly growing one, the one where it's growing, but it's kind of slowing down. And as the base narrows, the population growth rate decreases. And it can eventually almost look like a vase or a vase, where the population will be slowly constricting or decreasing. So, which of these age structure diagrams best depicts the ages in a population that is in the stage 3 of demographic transition? Now, when I was choosing these questions, I don't know, I somehow overlooked the fact that we had not talked about demographic transitions yet. So I'm actually, if you got this question wrong, I'm going to be giving you points back. Okay. During stage 3, the rate of growth is not necessarily as rapid as you would see in the earlier stages of like stage 2, but it is still experiencing a substantial growth in population size. So again, if you got this question wrong, I will be giving you points back. Okay. And so here we got another age structure diagrams, a little bit more detail. We got our females on the right-hand side, our males, and the number of individuals in millions per age demographic cohort. Which of the following characteristics is most closely associated with a country that demonstrates this age structure diagram? Well, if you look at this diagram, it's really broad at the base. And so this means there's a lot of reproductive potential for this particular population. Remember, reproductive potential is determined by the number of individuals who are in their reproductive years, or also who are about to enter that, right? So you can see there's a substantial number of people who are currently in their reproductive um, uh, uh, lifespans. And then we've also got a large number of children that will eventually, right, go through puberty and have the biological potential of having children. So we would expect the trend to continue, right? And the base of this pyramid would get broader in the next coming years. Now, we don't know for sure because we don't know, what has happened recently in this country. Maybe they've implemented some kind of family restriction protocol. Maybe they've got family planning programs that recently took off. And so we're not for sure, but we can make an approximation. This population will continue to increase. So we would know that this is a country with a very high total fertility rate. Here we've got a little bit more data, right? We got 4 countries with their populations, their birth rates, their death rates, the total fertility rate, which is the number of children per woman, right? Which you would have learned about yesterday in more detail. We got infant mortality rate, which I'm going to talk about today, and then life expectancy. For this, and to make an accurate prediction, you really only need to understand like the births and death rates. And we've already talked about birth and death when we went over to like normal population dynamics, right? With like normal populations, you got to have more babies born than there are individuals dying to see any kind of increase in your population. And so we've got a pyramid right here. So which of the following countries is most likely represented in this age structure diagram? Okay, so what can we pull from this diagram? Well, I see again that this population is rapidly growing. There are quite a few children and very few elderly, right? So life expectancy is probably not all that high. And there's mostly children in this country, right? You can see that the population drops off pretty drastically as you get into the middle-aged individuals. So I would say that this country is growing and growing quite rapidly. So which of these countries has the highest like birth to death rate ratio, or what's the biggest difference? And if you look here at country B, you got 45 babies born per 1,000 individuals, whereas you've got 13 individuals dying, but that's still a substantial difference. We're talking like over 30 um, between the two, right? And that's the greatest difference compared to the other countries. And you also look at total fertility rate. We haven't gotten there yet, but the word is, I think, very indicative of what it represents, right? Fertility, you're talking about, you know, um, productivity as far as populations are concerned. And so it's got the highest one, right? So B would definitely be the best choice for this one. And then, today we'll talk about why countries display demographic pyramids like this and what can be done to change it if and so that is what that country desires. Okay, let's take a look at 3.7. And we're looking at total fertility rates, which is what you learned about yesterday. Sorry. Same chart. The total fertility rate in country A was 6.8 in 1980. So that means that the average number of children a woman had in country A and their life was almost 7. That's a lot of children. Which of the following statements best supports the change in the total fertility rate country A from 1980 to 2015? Well, if we look at country A in 2015, their total fertility rate is only 3. So it's gone down by about half. Now, why would the women in this country be having fewer children, right? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Generally speaking, total fertility rates decrease as a country becomes more developed. And as a country becomes more developed, generally speaking, these women are going to have a more equitable access to education. They're going to have a more employment opportunities. They're going to be getting married later on in life, and they'll have access to family planning, right? And so that will allow them to make conscious, informed decisions about the size of their family in the future in years to come. So the best answer is the total fertility rate decreased as a result of a delay in the first marriage and increase in contraceptive use. Because you have to remember, in countries where women are married off in their early teens, right, they're going to be far more likely to produce a greater number of children over their lifespan compared to somebody who maybe gets married or decides to have a family in their late 20s or 30s, right? And there's a lot of other factors that we'll talk about today that influence total fertility. Which of the following countries has achieved replacement level fertility? Well, replacement level fertility was something that was addressed in yesterday's AP Daily video, and that is exactly what it sounds like. What is the fertility rate needed to replace the parents, right? And so you would intuitively think that the number would be 2, right? That the woman had at least exactly 2 babies, that the population would be very, very stable, right? Because the woman would produce 2 children, which would replace herself as well as her mate. But that's not necessarily the case. The replacement level fertility needs to actually be slightly higher than 2 children per woman. Can anyone hypothesize as to why replacement level fertility needs to be slightly higher than 2? You can put it in the chat, or you can simply... Yes, excellent. Right. So one answer so far, that's great, is having a replacement level of 2.1 takes into the account that some women and some couples are going to decide not to have babies, right? And so if you're going to replace the current population, the individuals that are having children need to have slightly more, not much, 2.1, to potentially offset the individuals who are choosing not to have children, right? What else besides choice? Or yes, and the Jayla cannot. Some people are infertile. What might be another reason why we would need to have a replacement level of fertility slightly higher than 2? And it actually varies from country to country, the replacement level fertility. Yes, thank you, Hal. If some infants die before their first birthday, some children die due to disease, accidents, whatever. And so we need to account for that. And so that's why the replacement level fertility does vary from country to country. A country that has, higher infant mortality and child mortality might have a slightly higher replacement level fertility. So which of the following countries has achieved replacement level fertility? We're going to be, close to 2, and that would be C, country C. Country B and A still are far above replacement, so their population is still going to be growing. And then country D is below replacement, so their population would actually be shrinking, right? But not necessarily incredibly rapidly. Okay, so here we have a chart with various countries around the world and their total fertility rates. Which of the statements describes the trends? Well, if you look at these countries and you think about these different countries, and this is where if you've had AP Human Geography, or if you've ever had a geography course, I don't know if they teach geography in middle school, or just a better global understanding of where these countries are and their demographic and economic situations, you can kind of make some inferences based on total fertility rates. Generally speaking, the more developed a country is, the lower their total fertility rate. The less developed the country is, in the case of least developed countries, the higher the total fertility rate. And again, we'll kind of go over why that is today. All right, so let's go ahead and quickly take our chimpanzee survey. Are you smarter than a chimpanzee? And don't cheat, y'all. This is supposed to be just kind of a fun, test your intuition, right? Like I want you to answer this based on your gut feeling, right? So if you would go to joinpd.com and please type in this code and join. There are currently 24 of you guys. If for whatever reason, maybe bandwidth or tech issues, if you can't get into the PD, send me a message on the private chat and you can play along privately. Okay, because what I'm doing is I'm collecting your answers today, and then we'll kind of compare them on Thursday, talking about what you guys saw in the video tomorrow. One of my favorite people, Hans Rosling, human demographer. Well, he was a professor of global health, but his kind of like side passion is human demography and statistics in general. All right, it's okay. Just play in the chat if your Wi-Fi can't support it. And I'm gonna need to start really shortly, so let's go ahead and get joined. And if you can't, just play in the chat. The private chat would be perfectly fine. All right, I'm gonna need to get started. So if you had a chance to join, you're just gonna have to play along in the private chat. Okay, so first question in our survey. And again, don't look it up. How did the deaths per year from natural disasters change in the last century? So over the last 100 years, what do you think? Did the number of people dying from natural disasters, did it double? Did it remain the same, or did it decrease? If you can't get it to work, just listen to what I'm saying. First question, how did the deaths per year from natural disasters change in the last century? Do you think it doubled, remained the same, or decreased? Okay, next question. Women aged 30, right? So women who are currently age 30 on planet Earth, how many years do you think they spent in school? Men of the same age spent on average 8 years. So women alive on planet Earth today who are age 30, we're talking the global average, 7 years of education, 5 years of education, or 3 years. What do you think the average is? 7, 5, or 3? So 7 years would be like a little bit of middle school education, 5 years would be like a complete elementary school education, and 3 years would be a very incomplete, very informal education. So 7, 5, or 3. Okay, and then the last question. In the last 20 years, the number of people living in extreme poverty has doubled, remained the same, or almost halved. So, has the number of people living in extreme poverty, has it gone up? Has it stayed the same, or has it decreased? What do you think? Doubled, remain the same, or halved? Increase, same, or decrease? Give you another minute to answer. And again, tomorrow there's a video that I have linked on your to-do list that you will watch. And in that video, they will go over these questions again. But now, instead of it just being you guys, he actually surveys people in Sweden, people in the United Kingdom, college students, and chimpanzees, right? And he sees how their answers are different and then explains why, right? So it's a really, really neat kind of uh, mental experiment, if you will. So I'm going to go ahead and end this. Oh, let me save it so we can go over it on Thursday. Chimp survey, save and end. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and jump into our lesson for today. So yesterday you were supposed to learn about fertility rates, also sometimes referred to as natality. Total fertility rates, again, is the average number of children a woman will have over their reproductive lifespan. And then replacement level will be the number of children a female or a couple needs to have to replace them, to sustain current population levels. And you can see that the global fertility rates, right, have decreased, right? And you can see that from 1990 to 2015, it has gone down. And the prediction is that it will continue to go down, and we'll talk about why that is. Now, here on this map, you can see the very different conditions in regards to total fertility rates that we see here on planet Earth. Purple being 7 to 7.9 children per woman, so very high total fertility rates. And then down here, almost like blue. I don't know why they chose this color, right? I mean, it almost looks like purple, right? For very, very low TFRs, right? So just to make sure you can differentiate between the colors, the purple would be like here in a country known as Niger. And then this color right here would be like what you see in South Korea, right? And so let's look at some general trends, right? And so the yellows, the oranges, reds, and purples, these indicate higher than replacement level fertility, right? So where are we going to see the future growth? We're going to see a lot of the future growth in Africa and in Asia. Where are we not going to see growth? Well, let's look at replacement level, right? So anything that's green. So the areas of this map that are green are going to be like somewhat stable, right? They're right at or around replacement level fertility. And then anything in blue, these are going to be countries that are going to experience a decrease in population due to the fact that their fertility rates are below replacement level fertility. Now, there's a lot of reasons why countries have high TFRs and countries have low TFRs. But if you look at the map, it's pretty quick. It's fairly easy to kind of differentiate. Generally speaking, countries that are more developed, right? And we don't use terms like first world and third world, right? That's incredibly offensive and derogatory. Don't use those terms, right? That's like Cold World or Cold War style conversations about other countries. It's more appropriate to talk and consider it if you talk about their current economic or socioeconomics. We have developed, developing, and least developed. And the least developed countries economically are going to be found on the continent of Africa, right? There are definitely some countries in Eurasia that fit that bill. And then the countries that have the lowest total fertility rates are going to be the countries that are generally the most developed, right? And then you're going to find the in-between, right, with developing countries. Now, let's kind of talk about some situations and some struggles here. So why does Nigeria have such a high total fertility rate? Well, it's a very, very poor country. About half of the people that live in this country live on about $1 a day, right? So think about that, $1 every day. And you might be thinking, well, if you had so little money, why would you have so many children? Well, the total fertility rate doesn't take into account how many of those children actually survive. So in a country like Nigeria that's very poor, people living on $1 a day are not going to have access to healthcare, not going to have access to family planning. And so a lot of their infants are going to die. So they're going to have high infant mortality rates. There's going to be high child death rates, right? So although they might have 6 or 7 children per woman, maybe only 4 of them actually reach adulthood, right? And so that's a motivating factor for these individuals, because when they're having children, they know that statistically speaking, a lot of them will not survive. Um, Now, why are some of the surrounding countries have lower TFRs? Well, there's lots of different reasons. Africa is a massive continent, right? If you in Mercator projections, like these kind of maps kind of skew the size of things, but I mean, Africa is a massive continent made of many different countries, and each of these countries have unique histories and cultures and languages and religions and spiritual beliefs and different value systems for families, right? And who makes the decisions, or is it better to have more children or less children, and then take into account their economic development. So Nigeria, the country right here, so this is Nigeria, Chad, that's Mali. Nigeria has a much lower TFR, right? And you might be thinking, it's still high, but it's still 2 children less per woman. And that's because they've recently experienced a surge in economic growth and development. They're a lot of their oil refineries and fossil fuels have really kind of put them on the map financially. The video that you guys watched yesterday about Angola, right, the deadliest place for a child, is why Angola has such a high TFR, because children are so likely to die earlier on in their lives, which is crazy because Angola, as mentioned in the video, is an incredibly wealthy country, right? And then you get other countries that have, they're approaching replacement level, right? Countries like Egypt, and there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Interactions with Europe and interactions with different countries, and how long were you a colony? And there's just so many aspects to why some of these countries have high TFRs and low TFRs. Now, a lot of it, again, has to do with economic development. So I was talking in terms of 3 groups: developed, developing, and least developed. And I think that's the easiest thing to kind of wrap your mind around. The World Bank classifies countries into 4 categories. You got high income, which are dark green; upper middle income, right, would be lighter green; lower middle income; and then low income, right? So red being the least gross national income per capita, and then dark green would be the highest. Okay. Now, what does this mean? Like gross national income per capita, or gross national product per capita? Well, this is a term that we can use as demographers to kind of approximate where these countries are in their development as an economy. And so we got 2 terms that we commonly use: gross national product, which is very similar to GNI, and then we've got gross domestic product, right? So we can kind of use both to gauge the economies of these countries. Gross national product is gross, so means total; national product, so anybody who is an American citizen, right, or an American company, even if it's international, if it's still an American company, or if you're still a US citizen, the goods and services, the value of those goods and services count towards our gross national product. Gross domestic product's different. Gross domestic product, domestic is referring to the goods and services traded and provided within a country. So even if somebody is a citizen of Ireland, and if they're working in the United States, their goods and services contribute to our gross domestic product, but they'd also contribute to the gross national product of Ireland. And I know it can be kind of confusing, right? But I'm going to simplify it here in just a second. Just think about this as like how much money the country makes, right? Whether you look at gross national product, gross domestic product, for our intents and purposes, you could think about them as being very similar. From an economic standpoint, gross national product is usually higher in countries that have a more international presence, and gross domestic products tend to be much higher in countries that have a lot of well-developed infrastructure, right, and business occurring within that country, right? And so that can be used to kind of differentiate between like their style of economies. But for us, we're just saying, how wealthy is this country? And we typically think of these numbers in terms of per capita, right? So per capita means per person, right? And so you can think about it in some serious generalizations, right? So a lot of people think developed countries are countries that have gross national products per capita of more than 10,000. Sorry. more than 10,000. Developing countries would fall within that range of 1,000 to 10,000 US dollars um, per capita. And then obviously your least developed countries would be less than $1,000 a year, right? So you can almost think about it like salary, right? If you just want to think about it like that. So you might be thinking, holy smokes, you mean to tell me if someone had a salary of $10,000, they'd be considered living in a developed nation? Absolutely, right? Now, compared to our perceptions of money and value and goods and resources and possessions, we think $10,000 is well below poverty, and it is. But in some places, that's a good living. In developing countries, even countries like India, you're going to see projections of uh, gross national product per capita for the average Indian citizen being like $2,000-3,000, right, per year. And then obviously we have some countries like Mozambique and Madagascar, Somalia, again, Nigeria, where people are living on less than $1,000 a year. And in a lot of these places, we're talking about extreme poverty, people living on $1 a day. So we've got developed, developing, and least developed, right? And if you think about the previous graph, high TFR, high poverty, right? So LDCs, high TFR. If you look up here in Europe, right? Lots of wealth, low TFRs. We go to South America, right? That's light green, right? That's definitely a good sign, right? They're developing, like so middle high income, right? And then lower TFRs, right? So there is a correlation, but why? It's not always guaranteed. There's always some exceptions to the rules, right? It's just kind of neat to look at the statistics sometimes. Now, we can also look at it in graphical form, right? We can see that we've got our total fertility rate here, the y-axis, and then our GDP per capita. Again, just think about this like money per person, right? And so you can see that in places where there's GDP lower than 5,000, total fertility rates are really high, and high GDP per capita usually result in lower total fertility rates. Now, there's always exceptions, right? Because of culture, right? There are different cultural valuation systems for the number of children a family may or may not have. Now, why? Why I like this graph right here. This is actually from statistics from India, right? So India is also like Africa, right? And that's very diverse as far as ethnicity is concerned. There's lots of religions, lots of languages, lots of cultures and valuation systems, and that affects these statistics as well. And if we want to go and just talk straight about, okay, does money really tell us about total fertility rates? We can see down here, these are the different states found in India, right? The country is kind of divided up in regions, much like it is in the United States. And we've got our total fertility rates from lowest to highest. And so what would our assumption be about per capita distribution, right? Or we would think that obviously the lower total fertility rates would be associated with really high gross domestic products per capita. And in the case of Goa, it is, right? But there's always varying aspects to the problem, right? You can see that West Bengal right here is got a very similar total fertility rate, but a significant disparity in the gross domestic product per capita in these areas, right? So it's not always, but it's a good place to start. We can definitely see there's a general trend between the highest and the lowest. And these are in Indian rupees, which I think this would be like $2,000 per year. And I think that would be like $200 per year as an approximation. What's also neat is we need to think about education, because education plays a significant role in the decisions about families, right? Family planning and being educated, just about anything really, because that's going to provide more opportunity for individuals to earn a living. And what's interesting here is you can see that Goa, despite having an incredibly high gross domestic product per capita, has a lower literacy rate than Kerala, right? So Kerala, India, right, has, like almost like what, a third of the gross domestic product, but a much higher literacy rate. Again, lots of differences in the ways in which cultures, societies, and governments set up opportunities. The states of India are vastly different. I spent some time, I think 5 or 6 weeks in India, backpacking across southern India, and you go from one state to the next, and it's like entering a different country, right? So there's a lot of differences and changes. And infant mortality rate always plays a substantial role in the total fertility rates. Generally speaking, the higher the infant mortality rate, as you see over here, the higher the total fertility rate, because they know that in this case, this is probably crude, so it's 59 children will die per 1,000 births. And so these individuals know that some of the children that they're going to have are not going to survive. And remember, total fertility rate doesn't take into account that these children did not survive, right? They died before their first birthday or even earlier on. I like this right here because we can take a look at probably one of the more profound effects or influencers on total fertility rates, and that is contraceptive use and contraceptive access. And this goes with education and family planning. Are contraceptives readily available in these countries? If they are, by and large, the total fertility rate will decrease. And it's also coming down to education, right? Because some people truly don't understand, how contraceptives work, right? Or they don't trust the efficacy, right? How well they actually work. And you can see that from 1994 till now, according to the United Nations, that there has been almost 9% increase in contraceptive use. And that's why we see a decrease in population growth. And you can see in places like Africa, where there is the highest predicted potential for population growth, in countries that are rapidly growing, there is a growing number of individuals who are gaining access to contraceptives. And contraceptives are things like birth control or condoms, right? Devices and medications that can be used to control, right, the reproductive potential of a country. And a lot of this really does come down to equitable access, right? Do the women in these countries have access to contraceptives, and do they have the proper education and the professionals there to administer the contraceptives? And because of this, right, this increase in contraceptive use since 1950 till now, the children per woman, the total TFR internationally, worldwide, has decreased, right? So when your parents or your your grandparents and your parents, they lived in a completely different world in regards to reproductive potential, right? When your grandparents were y'all's age, there was probably like 3 billion people on the planet, and now there's almost 8 billion, right? Despite this decrease, right? We can see total fertility rates have been decreasing as suggested in the previous graph, but we can also see that future projections also look like we're going to see a continual decrease, except for Europe, right? Europe's total fertility rate has decreased substantially over the last couple of decades, and the predictions are that it will actually slightly increase closer to replacement level fertility. And there are actually a couple governments and programs across Europe that are actually trying to encourage people to have children, right? To kind of keep their population stable. And there are other countries like Japan that are probably in the near future going to come up with financial incentives, like, please have more children. We may even pay you to do so. Now, there are lots of different aspects to the population dynamic, right? So the ebb and flow of a human population, but the main ones are going to be birth and death rates, right? And again, birth rates are going to be associated with total fertility rates. Birth rates can be represented as a percentage or as a crude birth rate. Now, if I said, okay, a country has a birth rate of 3%, you think, what does that mean? Well, it means that figure out what 3% of that total population is, and you'll figure out how many babies are being born. But that's hard to think about in your head. You're like, okay, for the United States, what's 3% of 330 million, right? It's much easier to think about this in terms of crude birth rate. It makes more sense to our brains because most of us can envision 1,000 people. If you think about like the Patton basketball stadium or gym, if it were full of people, it's probably going to be, all of Patton, it might be close to 1,000, right? And so what is 3% of 1,000? Well, 3% of 100 is 3. So 1,000, you add a zero, That'd be 30 babies born per 1,000 individuals. And this, we can kind of envision the Patton Auditorium like packed full of people, and 30 of the people in that room are pregnant, right? Death rate, we can give it as a percentage as well. Let's do a death rate of 1% to make the math a little bit more fun. And again, I'm going to go over a lot of math problems later on this week. We just had to change a lot of things around. So if a death rate is 1%, you're like, oh, shoot, that doesn't make sense to me. What's 1% of 330 million? I think it's much easier to think about it in terms of crude, right? And so 1% of 1,000 would be 10 people dying per 1,000. Again, so if the auditorium were packed at Patton full of people that represent every age demographic, right? So like just a random sampling of people from the city of Morganton or Burke County, if Burke County had a 1% death rate, it would be 10 people in that room are going to not live to see the end of that year. And we can use these to determine what is known as the annual natural growth rate, right? So the natural growth rate does not take into account migration, because right now we're just talking about births and deaths, and it's usually represented as a lowercase r. Hey, that makes me think of R selected species because the reproduction is their thing, right? And so we can actually use this growth rate to make some approximations about the future for a country. And there's this really neat equation called the rule of 70, right? And you take the number 70 and you divide it by R. And R is the percent growth rate. And so if we try to figure out, right, the growth rate for this country, all you need to do is births minus deaths, and that would give us a growth rate of 2%, right? And so we can plug this number in for R. And what we get, if we take 70 and divide it by 2, we get 35. What the heck does this number mean? Well, the rule of 70 can be used to calculate something known as the doubling time. The amount of time needed, that's supposed to be a G. The doubling time, the amount of time needed for a population to double, right? So if a country had a growth rate of 2%, that means in 35 years, that population would double in size. Now, this is a rough approximation because the assumption is that the growth rate remains the same year in and year out. We know that's not necessarily the case. Growth rates do change from one year to the next. But it's a good place to start, right? And we'll actually be doing some more math with this later. And then we've got infant mortality rate, or IMR, okay, with the number of babies that die before their first birthday. It can be represented as a percentage of live births, or it could be crude, which would be, number of babies that die before their first birthday per 1,000 births, okay? And again, infant mortality is an incredible way to evaluate the healthcare system of a country. Because if a country can't take care of its infants, then what can it take care of, right? That's the future of that particular country. And so it's usually a pretty good indication of the quality of healthcare. And so we look at birth rates and death rates, and we'll actually look at some more of these graphs later. They can have a substantial effect, the difference between the two, on population size. If birth rates and death rates are about the same, there's not going to be a much of an increase in population. But when there's a disparity, right, whether it's an incredibly high birth rate or an incredibly low death rate, that's where we see changes in population. Now, this is an interesting graph. This is actually a graph of population data from Eastern Europe and Russia. Now, looking at this graph, what would we expect? Is this population going to grow, stay the same, or decrease? Put it in the chat right now. Looking based on this graph, is this population going to increase, decrease, or stay the same? Yeah, this is going to decrease because look, the birth rate was really, really, really high, right, in the early 80s, and death rate was relatively low, comparatively speaking. And then something happened. The birth rate drops and the death rate skyrockets. This is actually known as the Russian cross because human demographers have noticed this trend in a lot of Eastern Europe and in Russia, and it's associated with the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are lots of different hypotheses that human demographers have come up as to why, right, Eastern Europe has experienced this change, but it could by and large be due to economic instability, right? Or it could have something to do with societal pressures, behaviors. I've actually seen one hypothesis that has something to do with alcohol, right? And it also may have something to do with the baby boomers of Russia, right, were born after World War II and them simply dying of old age. And so it's not always a general increase. Every country is going to have a unique set of birth rates and death rates. We can look at infant mortality, right? And again, we saw, least developed countries in Africa, we saw high TFRs. We also see high infant mortality rates. So, if we take into consideration all of them, the total fertility rate, the gross national product per capita, and the infant mortality rate, we can start to kind of envision what the environmental conditions are for people living in these cities and living in these areas. We don't know much about water quality and all that, but we do know that there's some significant instabilities that are resulting in a lot of infants dying. Now, child mortality, again, looking at income, has decreased across the board, right? So you can see here in the 1990s, right, child mortality, this is children dying before their 5th birthday, right, has decreased substantially. You can see here in lower income countries, you know, it was like as high as 18%, and now it's down to 6.9. So whatever we've been doing, and we'll talk a lot about this over the next couple of days, a lot of what we're doing is working, right? And so we need to kind of ditch that defeatist attitude of like, well, you know, everything's terrible in the world. There's nothing we can do about it, because clearly we have done something substantial to decrease child mortality, infant mortality, but there's still a long way to go. Now, I like to bring it home sometimes, because a lot of times we're obsessed with talking about other countries and, you know, how could it be so, you know, the infant mortality rate so high in these countries. Well, look at these. These are developed countries, right? And so these countries up here have relatively low infant mortality rates, right? And so a country like Norway, right, only 3 births per 1,000 die, right, before their first birthday. And you can see that there, you know, there's a disparity here, right? And then look at this, the United States of America, 5.8. We have twice as many infants dying per 1,000 births than some of these other European countries, right? And I'm thinking, why in the world might that be? Anybody, oh, well, our population's bigger. Nope, nope, nope. That has nothing to do with it, per se, because this is broken down to per 1,000s, right? So if there's 1,000 births in Norway, 3 of the babies will die before their first birthday. If there's 1,000 births in the United States, 5.8 of them, right? So it's still based on that percent of the total population, still based on that kind of, you know, snapshot of 1,000 individuals. So why, right? And so this is the neat thing about human demography. So you start looking at the data, then you start making some connections, and you're kind of like a detective, right? So why is the infant mortality rate so high in the United States? If I pulled someone off the street and I said, hey, what country has the best healthcare system on planet Earth, right? Most people are going to say, United States. Well, then how do they explain this? Right? If the United States of America has the best healthcare system, then why do we have almost double the infant mortality rate of other countries, right? It's not that simple. Well, we can take a look at some other statistics, right? This looks at premature births. So these are the percent of babies born prematurely, right? So pregnancy is 9 months, 9 months, 36 weeks. So what percent of these children are born between 22 and 36 weeks of premature birth? And you can see in the United States, again, nearly twice as high as some of these other developed countries, right? And obviously, if a baby is born prematurely, right, it's going to contribute to a higher infant mortality rate, because if a baby is born prematurely, there's going to be a lower percent likelihood that the baby will survive to their first birthday. And now the question is, why? How do we account for this? Why are so many babies born prematurely in the United States? And this is something I want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind, that, you know, we need to kind of let go of some of our generalizations about areas and really treat every country as its own unique experience, right? Because each country's got a unique set of environmental conditions, socioeconomic, political, religious, and all of these things contribute to these population dynamics. Now, we can, again, collect data from, you know, a lot of countries, and we can kind of come up with some like predictive stages, right? For as a country goes from being a least developed to a more developed country, we can look at the demographic transition stages, right? We can break it down into 5 stages. Some of these graphs will only have 4 stages. The first stage that a country experiences, and the first stage that the human population experienced for most of our history, was stage 1, where birth rates and death rates were both high. Mortality was high. People were dying of all kinds of diseases. Babies were dying. Children were dying. And so there was a high birth rate. And the population was stable, right? Because they were probably equal. Now, stage 2 is like, you know, the Industrial Revolution is starting, right? People are having an increased access to water, maybe increased access to food, maybe the introduction of some basic medications and medical facilities. And so initially the death rate's going to fall, right? The death rate's going to fall first, and the birth rate will kind of lag behind. And that's because culture moves slower than technology, right? you've probably read articles or comments about people making jokes about radio, like when the radio first came out. Like people are, they're never going to be into this. The TV, people said the same thing, right? They're like, why would we watch TV? We listen to the radio, read a book, so culture always kind of lags behind technology. And so despite the death rate falling, people maintain, right, higher birth rates because, again, culturally, right, historically, it was necessary. And it's going to take a while for these individuals to adjust their cultures to the change in their conditions, their living conditions. And during this period, when you have got a substantial decrease in death rate, but the birth rate still remains high, this is where you're going to see the most rapid population growth. Population is going to increase incredibly fast, exponentially. Now, eventually, culture kind of catches up and people have access to contraceptives and family planning, and they're realizing like, okay, wow, the death rate keeps going down. Fewer babies are dying. I don't need to have as many children. Maybe the economy has become more complex and people don't necessarily need to live in an agrarian society. People are pursuing higher education, getting married later in life. And so the birth rates decrease. And we're still seeing an increase, right? So it's not until birth rates and death rates are again equal or close to equal that we see the population kind of level out again. And you can see age demographic pyramids, right, to match these different stages. I like this chart right here. And if I were going to study or look at anything, this would be one of them, right? I think this single slide gives us the best kind of starting point for thinking about the environmental conditions for a individual in a country. And when I say environmental conditions, a lot of us, our brains instantly go to like, how many trees are there, the water. Yes, it's a part of it. We also need to think about, the environment is everything around us, right? So society, culture, the economy, all of that, the government systems, all of that is a part of our human environmental conditions. And there are some examples of different countries, right? And again, stage one is this is going to be your least developed countries. And then when they get into that early developing, that's when you see a substantial increase. And you don't want your country to get stuck in this particular transition. You want to make sure that you get death rate down, but then you're also just as swiftly getting the birth control or birth rate under control. Otherwise, these countries can grow too fast for their economies. And this is what we're seeing in Niger, right? There are more young people in Niger than there are elderly people. Now, I think I had something crazy. It was like 40% of their population is younger than 15. Right? And so what does that mean for the next decade for the country of Niger when those 40% of their population enters the working years of their life? Is the economy going to be able to keep up and provide jobs for these individuals, right? So you don't want to be stuck here, right? Because that puts a lot of pressure on your economic and government systems. So I would definitely take a look at this. And again, we'll be talking about these different demographic transitional periods over the next coming days. You'll be needing to think about this tomorrow while you're filling out your human or your countries of the world demographic data sheet. I'm going to ask you, okay, which stage do you think your country is currently in? And you're going to need to look at the birth rate and the death rate. What is the growth rate for that country, right? And be thinking like, okay, what are some comparable countries? Now, some of you guys might get lucky, right? And you're like, oh, I chose Brazil, and it says it right here. And some of you, for a quick Google search, it'll produce, this country is in this. And that's an approximation, it's just gives us a starting point for discussion. If you haven't already filled out your which country you're going to do for the countries of the world, please do that. Make sure it's not the same as anyone else's. And I was kind of disappointed. I did see some creativity, but I was kind of disappointed. I saw a lot of people choosing the standard, like, let me go pick the European countries, the countries we already know everything about. And it's not too late to change it, but really kind of challenge yourself, because there's so much more out there in the world, right? For you to just pick France, a country that you probably already know a good bit about, or you're at least familiar with. You're going to learn some things, but you're not going to learn nearly as much as if you chose a country like Bhutan, right, in Asia, or Uzbekistan. That's really going to broaden your worldview, right? Now, tomorrow I'll be on the lookout. I'm hopefully going to release it today, but just between today and tomorrow. Yeah, I think that's so. Someone just said, I chose Greece, but now I think I'm going to do Madagascar. I think you would learn so much more by choosing something like Madagascar. Yeah, you could do the Vatican City. You could do the Vatican City. You know, I mean, it'll give you an interesting perspective, you know, because it's kind of like uh, a country within a country, if you will. I think that's perfectly fine. All right. Well, be on the lookout for that demographic data sheet. And then don't forget tonight, you guys do have your reading and TQ 3.8. It's already available. So some of you might want to just go ahead and knock that out as quickly as possible. Tomorrow you'll work on your demographic data, and please watch this video, right? If you want to watch this video right now while it's still fresh in your memory, I think it'd be worthwhile as well. And I will see you guys on Thursday. If you have any questions about anything, please don't ever